to seduce their neighbor to a favorable opinion, and afterwards to believe implicitly in this opinion of their neighbor. Who can do this conjuring trick so well as women? That which an age considers evil is usually an unreasonable echo of what was formerly considered good, the atavism of an old ideal. Around the hero, everything becomes a tragedy. Around the demigod, everything becomes a satire play. And around God, everything becomes what? Perhaps a world? It is not enough to possess a talent. One must also have your permission to possess it. Eh, my friends? Where there is the tree of knowledge, there is always paradise. So say the most ancient and the most modern serpents. What is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. Objection, evasion, joyous distrust, and love of irony are signs of health. Everything absolute belongs to pathology. The sense of the tragic increases and declines with sensuousness. Insanity in individuals is something rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. The thought of suicide is a great consolation. By means of it, one gets successfully through many a bad night. Not only our reason, but also our conscience truckles to our strongest impulse, the tyrant in us. One must repay good and ill, but why just to the person who did us good or ill? One no longer loves one's knowledge sufficiently after one has communicated it. Poets act shamelessly towards their experiences. They exploit them. Our fellow creature is not our neighbor, but our neighbor's neighbor. So thinks every nation. Love brings to light the noble and hidden qualities of a lover, his rare and exceptional traits. It is thus liable to be deceptive as to his normal character. Jesus said to his Jews, "The law was for servants. Love God as I love him, as his son. What have we sons of God to do with morals?" In sight of every party, a shepherd has always need of a bell, whether, or he has himself to be a whether occasionally. One may indeed lie with the mouth, but with the accompanying grimace, one nevertheless tells the truth. To vigorous men, intimacy is a matter of shame and something precious. Christianity gave Eros poison to drink. He did not die of it, certainly, but degenerated to vice. To talk much about oneself may also be a means of concealing oneself. In praise, there is more and the noise of its wheels insupportable. One loves ultimately one's desires, not the thing desired. The vanity of others is only counter to our taste when it is counter to our vanity. With regard to what truthfulness is, perhaps nobody has ever been sufficiently truthful. One does not believe in the follies of clever men. What a forfeiture of the rights of man. The consequences of our actions seize us by the forelock. very indifferent to the fact that we have, meanwhile, reformed. There is an innocence in lying, which is the sign of good faith in a cause. It is inhuman to bless when one is being cursed. The familiarity of superiors embitters one, because it may not be returned. I am affected, not because you have deceived me, but because I can no longer believe in you. There is a haughtiness of kindness, which has the appearance of wickedness. I dislike him. Why? I am not a match for him. Did anyone ever answer so? Chapter 5. The Natural History of Morals. The moral sentiment in Europe at present is perhaps as subtle, belated, diverse, sensitive, and refined as the science of morals. Belonging thereto is recent, initial, awkward, and coarse-fingered. An interesting contrast, which sometimes becomes incarnate and obvious in the very person of a moralist. Indeed, the expression science of morals is, in respect to what is designated thereby, far too presumptuous and counter to good taste, which is always a foretaste of more modest expressions. One ought to avow, with the utmost fairness, what is still necessary here for a long time, what is alone proper for the present, namely, the collection of material, the comprehensive survey and classification of an immense domain of delicate sentiments of worth and distinctions of worth, which live, grow, propagate, and perish, and perhaps attempts to give a clear idea of the recurring and more common forms of these living crystallizations, as preparation for a theory of types of morality. To be sure, people have not hitherto been so modest. All the philosophers, with a pedantic and ridiculous seriousness, demanded of themselves something very much higher, more pretentious and ceremonious, when they concerned themselves with morality as a science. They wanted to give a basic to morality, and every philosopher hitherto has believed that he has given it a basis. Morality itself, however, has been regarded as something given. How far from their awkward pride was the seemingly insignificant problem, left in dust and decay, of a description of forms of morality. Notwithstanding that the finest hands and senses could hardly be fine enough for it, it was precisely owing to moral philosophers knowing the moral facts imperfectly, in an arbitrary epitome, or an accidental abridgment, perhaps as the morality of their environment, their position, their church, their zeitgeist, their climate and zone. It was precisely because they were badly instructed with regard to nations, eras, and past ages, and were by no means eager to know about these matters, that they did not even come in sight of the real problems of morals, problems which only disclose themselves by a comparison of many kinds of morals. In every science of morals, hitherto, strange as it may sound, the problem of morality itself has been omitted. There has been no suspicion that there was anything problematic there, that which philosophers called giving a base to morality, and endeavored to realize, has, when seen in a right light, proved merely a learned form of good faith in prevailing morality, a new means of its expression, consequently just a matter of fact within the sphere of a definite morality, yea, in its ultimate motive, a sort of denial that it is lawful for this morality to be called in question, and in any case the reverse of the testing, analyzing, doubting, and vivisecting of this very faith. Here, for instance, with what innocence almost worthy of honor, Schopenhauer represents his own task, and draw your conclusions concerning the scientificness of a science whose latest master still talks in the strain of children and old wives. The principle, he says, page 136 of the Grundprobleme der Ethik, footnote, pages 54 and 55 of Schopenhauer's Basis of Morality, translated by author B. Bullock, M.A., 1903. The axiom about the purport of which all moralists are practically agreed, neminem laid immo omnes quantum potes juva, is really the proposition which all moral teachers strive to establish, the real basis of ethics which has been sought, like the philosopher's stone, for centuries. The difficulty of establishing the proposition referred to may indeed be great. It is well known that Schopenhauer also was unsuccessful in his efforts, and whoever has thoroughly realized how absurdly false and sentimental this proposition is, in a world whose essence is will to power, may be reminded that Schopenhauer, although a pessimist, actually played the flute daily after dinner. One may read about the matter in his biography. A question, by the way. A repudiator of God and of the world, who makes a halt at morality, who assents to morality, and plays the flute to laude neminem morals. What? Is that really a pessimist?
Yeah, I think they got better now that it's COVID or something.
Apart from the value of such assertions as there is a categorical imperative in us, one can always ask, what does such an assertion indicate about him who makes it? There are systems of morals which are meant to justify their author in the eyes of other people. Other systems of morals are meant to tranquilize him and make him self-satisfied. With other systems, he wants to crucify and humble himself. With others, he wishes to take revenge. With others, to conceal himself. With others, to glorify himself and give superiority and distinction. This system of morals helps its author to forget that system makes him, or something of him, forgotten. Many a moralist would like to exercise power and creative arbitrariness over mankind. Many another, perhaps Kant especially, gives us to understand by his morals that what is estimable in me is that I know how to obey, and with you it shall not be otherwise than with me. In short, systems of morals are only a sign language of the emotions. In contrast to laissez-aller, every system of morals is a sort of tyranny against nature and also against reason. That is, however, no objection, unless one should again decree by some system of morals that all kinds of tyranny and unreasonableness are unlawful. What is essential and invaluable in every system of morals is that it is a long constraint in order to understand Stoicism, or Port Royal, or Puritanism. One should remember the constraint under which every language has attained to strength and freedom. The metrical constraint. The tyranny of rhyme and rhythm. How much trouble have the poets and orators of every nation given themselves? Not excepting some of the prose writers of today, in whose ears dwells an inexorable conscientiousness. For the sake of a folly, as utilitarian bunglers say, and thereby deem themselves wise, from submission to arbitrary laws, as the anarchists say, and thereby fancy themselves free, even free-spirited. The singular fact remains, however, that everything of the nature of freedom, elegance, boldness, dance, and masterly certainty, which exists or has existed, whether it be in thought itself, or in administration, or in speaking and persuading, in art, just as in conduct, has only developed by means of the tyranny of such arbitrary laws. And in all seriousness, it is not at all improbable that precisely this is nature and natural, and not laisser-aller. Every artist knows how different from the state of letting himself go is his most natural condition. The free arranging, locating, disposing, and constructing in the moments of inspiration, and how strictly and delicately he then obeys 1,000 laws, which by their very rigidness and precision defy all formulation by means of ideas. Even the most stable idea has, in comparison therewith, something floating, manifold, and ambiguous in it. The essential thing in heaven and in earth is apparently, to repeat it once more, that there should be long obedience in the same direction. Thereby results, and has always resulted in the long run, something which has made a life worth living. For instance, virtue, art, music, dance, reason, spirituality, anything whatever that is transfiguring, refined, foolish, or divine, the long bondage of the spirit, the distrustful constraint in the communicability of ideas. The discipline which the thinker imposed on himself to think in accordance with the rules of a church or a court, or conformable to Aristotelian premises. The persistent spiritual will to interpret everything that happened according to a Christian scheme, and in every occurrence to rediscover and justify the Christian God. All this violence, arbitrariness, severity, dreadfulness, and unreasonableness has proved itself the disciplinary means whereby the European spirit has attained its strength, its remorseless curiosity and subtle mobility. Granted also that much irrecoverable strength and spirit had to be stifled, suffocated, and spoilt in the process. For here, as everywhere, nature shows herself as she is, in all her extravagant and indifferent magnificence, which is shocking, but nevertheless noble. That for centuries, European thinkers only thought in order to prove something. Nowadays, on the contrary, we are suspicious of every thinker who wishes to prove something. That it was always settled beforehand what was to be the result of their strictest thinking, as it was perhaps in the Asiatic astrology of former times, or as it is still at the present day in the innocent Christian moral explanation of immediate personal events for the glory of God or for the good of the soul. This tyranny, this arbitrariness, this severe and magnificent stupidity has educated the spirit. Slavery, both in the coarser and the finer sense, is apparently an indispensable means even of spiritual education and discipline. One may look at every system of morals in this light. It is nature therein which teaches us to hate the laisser-aller, the too great freedom, and implants the need for limited horizons, for immediate duties. It teaches the narrowing of perspective, and thus, in a certain sense, that stupidity is a condition of life and development. Thou must obey someone, and for a long time, otherwise thou wilt come to grief and lose all respect for thyself. This seems to me to be the moral imperative of nature, which is certainly neither categorical, as old Kant wished, consequently the otherwise, nor does it address itself to the individual. What does nature care for the individual? But to nations, races, ages, and ranks. Above all, however, to the animal, man, generally to mankind. Industrious races find it a great hardship to be idle. It was a masterstroke of English instinct to hallow and begloom Sunday to such an extent that the Englishman unconsciously hankers for his week and workday again, as a kind of cleverly devised, cleverly intercalated fast, such as is also frequently found in the ancient world, although, as is appropriate in southern nations, not precisely with respect to work. Many kinds of fasts are necessary, and wherever powerful influences and habits prevail, legislators have to see that intercalary days are appointed, on which such impulses are fettered, and learn to hunger anew. Viewed from a higher standpoint, whole generations and epochs, when they show themselves infected with any moral fanaticism, seem like those intercalated periods of restraint and fasting, during which an impulse learns to humble and submit itself. At the same time also to purify and sharpen itself. Certainly philosophical sects likewise admit of a similar interpretation. For instance, the Stoa, in the midst of Hellenic culture, with the atmosphere rank and overcharged with aphrodisiacal odors. Here also is a hint for the explanation of the paradox. Why it was precisely in the most Christian period of Europe history, and in general only under the pressure of Christian sentiments, that the sexual impulse sublimated into love, amour, passion. There is something in the morality of Plato which does not really belong to Plato, but which only appears in his philosophy, one might say in spite of him, namely Socratism, for which he himself was too noble. No one desires to injure himself, hence all evil is done unwittingly. The evil man inflicts injury on himself. He would not do so, however, if he knew that evil is evil. The evil man, therefore, is only evil through error. If one free him from error, one will necessarily make him good. This mode of reasoning savors of the populace, who perceive only the unpleasant consequences of evildoing, and practically judge that it is stupid to do wrong, while they accept good as identical with useful and pleasant, without further thought. As regards every system of utilitarianism, one may at once assume that it has the same origin, and follow the scent. One will seldom err. Plato did all he could to interpret something refined and noble into the tenets of his teacher. And above all, to interpret himself into them. He, the most daring of all interpreters, who lifted the entire Socrates out of the street as a popular theme and song, to exhibit him in endless and impossible modifications, namely, in all his own disguises and multiplicities, in jest and in Homeric language as well. What is the Platonic Socrates, if not Greek words inserted here? The old theological problem of faith and knowledge, or more plainly, of instinct and reason, the question whether in respect to the valuation of things, instinct deserves more authority than rationality, which wants to appreciate and act according to motives, according to a why. That is to say, in conformity to purpose and utility. It is always the old moral problem that first appeared in the person of Socrates and had divided men's minds long before Christianity. Socrates himself, following, of course, the taste of his talent, that of a surpassing dialectician, took first the side of reason. And, in fact, what did he do all his life but laugh at the awkward incapacity of the noble Athenians, who were men of instinct, like all noble men, and could never give satisfactory answers concerning the motives of their actions? In the end, however, though silently and secretly, he laughed also at himself with his finer conscience and introspection. He found in himself the same difficulty and incapacity. But why, he said to himself, should one, on that account, separate oneself from the instincts? One must set them right, and the reason also. One must follow the instincts, but at the same time persuade the reason to support them with good arguments. This was the real falseness of that great and mysterious ironist. He brought his conscience up to the point that he was satisfied with a kind of self-outwitting. In fact, he perceived the irrationality in the moral judgment. Plato, more innocent in such matters, and without the craftiness of the plebeian, wished to prove himself at the expenditure of all his strength a philosopher had ever expended. That reason and instinct led spontaneously to one goal, to the good, to God. And since Plato, all theologians and philosophers have followed the same path, which means that in matters of morality, instinct, or as Christians call it, faith, or as I call it, the herd, has hitherto triumphed, unless one should make an exception in the case of Descartes, the father of rationalism, and, consequently, the grandfather of the revolution, who recognized only the authority of reason. But reason is only a tool, and Descartes was superficial. Whoever has followed the history of a single science finds in its development a clue to the understanding of the oldest and commonest processes of all, knowledge and cognizance. There, as here, the premature hypotheses, the fictions, the good, stupid will to believe, and the lack of distrust and patience are first developed. Our senses learn to hate, and never learn completely to be subtle, reliable, and cautious organs of knowledge. Our eyes find it easier on a given occasion to produce a picture already often produced than to seize upon the divergence and novelty of an impression. The latter requires more farce, more morality. It is difficult and painful for the ear to listen to anything new. We hear strange music badly. When we hear another language spoken, we involuntarily attempt to form the sounds into words with which we are more familiar and conversant. It was thus, for example, that the Germans modified the spoken word arqueballista into armburst, crossbow. Our senses are also hostile and adverse to the new, and generally, even in the simplest process of sensation, the emotions dominate, such as fear, love, hatred, and the passive emotion of indolence. As little as a reader nowadays reads all the single words, not to speak of syllables, of a page, he rather takes about 5 out of every 20 words at random and guesses the probably appropriate sense to them. Just as little do we see a tree correctly and completely in respect to its leaves, branches, color, and shape. We find it so much easier to fancy the chance of a tree. even in the midst of the most remarkable experiences, we still do just the same. We fabricate the greater part of the experience, and can hardly be made to contemplate any event, except as inventors thereof. All this goes to prove that from our fundamental nature and from remote ages we have been accustomed to lying, or, to express it more politely and hypocritically, in short, more pleasantly. One is much more of an artist than one is aware of. In an animated conversation, I often see the face of the person with whom I am speaking so clearly and sharply defined before me, according to the thought he expresses or which I believe to be evoked in his mind, that the degree of distinctness far exceeds the strength of my visual faculty, the delicacy of the play of the muscles and of the expression of the eyes must, therefore, be imagined by me. Probably the person put on quite a different expression, or none at all. Quidquid lus fui, tenebris agi. But also, contrariwise, what we experience in dreams, provided we experience it often, pertains at last just as much to the general belongings of our soul as anything actually experienced. By virtue thereof, we are richer or poorer. We have a requirement more or less, and finally, in broad daylight, and even in the brightest moments of our waking life, we are ruled to some extent by the nature of our dreams. Supposing that someone has often flown in his dreams, and that at last, as soon as he dreams, he is conscious of the power and art of flying as his privilege and his peculiarly enviable happiness. Such a person who believes that on the slightest impulse he can actualize all sorts of curves and angles, who knows the sensation of a certain divine levity, and upwards without effort or constraint, downwards without descending or lowering without trouble. How could the man with such dream experiences and dream habits fail to find happiness, differently colored and defined, even in his waking hours? How could he fail to long differently for happiness? Flight, such as described by poets, must, when compared with his own flying, be far too earthly, muscular, violent, far too troublesome for him. The difference among men does not manifest itself only in the difference of their list of desirable things, in their regarding different good things as worth striving for, and being disagreed as to the greater or less value, the order of rank of the commonly recognized desirable things. It manifests itself much more in what they regard as actually having and possessing a desirable thing. As regards a woman, for instance, the control over her body and her sexual gratification serves as an amply sufficient sign of ownership and possession to the more modest man. Another, with a more suspicious and ambitious thirst for possession, sees the questionableness, the mere apparentness of such ownership, and wishes to have finer tests in order to know especially whether the woman not only gives herself to him, but also gives up for his sake what she has or would like to have. Only then does he look upon her as possessed. A third, however, has not even here got to the limit of his distrust and his desire for possession. He asks himself whether the woman, when she gives up everything for him, does not perhaps do so for a phantom of him. He wishes first to be thoroughly, indeed profoundly well known, in order to be loved at all he ventures to let himself be found out. Only then does he feel the beloved one fully in his possession, when she no longer deceives herself about him, when she loves him just as much for the sake of his devilry and concealed insatiability as for his goodness, patience, and spirituality. One man would like to possess a nation, and he finds all the higher arts of Cagliostro and Catalina suitable for his purpose. Another, with a more refined thirst for possession, says to himself, "One may not deceive where one desires to possess." He is irritated and impatient at the idea that a mask of him should rule in the hearts of the people. I must, therefore, make myself known, and first of all, learn to know myself. Among helpful and charitable people, one almost always finds the awkward craftiness, which first gets up suitably him who has to be helped, as though, for instance, he should merit help, seek just their help, and would show himself deeply grateful, attached and subservient to them for all help. With these conceits, they take control of the needy as a property, just as in general they are charitable and helpful out of a desire for property. One finds them jealous when they are crossed or forestalled in their charity. Parents involuntarily make something like themselves out of their children. They call that education. No mother doubts at the bottom of her heart that the child she has born is thereby her property. No father hesitates about his right to his own ideas and notions of worth. Indeed, in former times, fathers deemed it right to use their discretion concerning the life or death of the newly born, as among the ancient Germans. And like the father, so also do the teacher, the class, the priest, and the prince still see in every new individual an objectionable opportunity for a new possession. The consequence is the Jews, a people born for slavery, as Tacitus and the whole ancient world say of them, the chosen people among the nations. As they themselves say and believe, the Jews performed the miracle of the inversion of valuations, by means of which life on earth obtained a new and dangerous charm for a couple of millenniums. Their prophets fused into one the expressions rich, godless, wicked, violent, sensual, and for the first time coined the word world as a term of reproach.
Your team has destroyed a tower.
In this inversion of valuations, in which is also included the use of the word poor as synonymous with saint and friend, the significance of the Jewish people is to be found. It is with them that the slave insurrection in morals commences. It is to be inferred that there are countless dark bodies near the sun, such as we shall never see among ourselves. This is an allegory, and the psychologist of morals reads the whole star writing merely as an allegorical and symbolic language in which much may be unexpressed. The beast of prey and the man of prey, for instance, Caesar Borgia, are fundamentally misunderstood. Nature is misunderstood so long as one seeks a morbidness in the constitution of these healthiest of all tropical monsters and growths, or even an innate hell in them, as almost all moralists have done hitherto. Does it not seem that there is a hatred of the virgin forest and of the tropics among moralists, and that the tropical man must be discredited at all costs, whether as disease and deterioration of mankind, or as his own hell and self-torture? And why? In favor of the temperate zones? In favor of the temperate men? The moral? The mediocre? This, for the chapter, Morals as Timidity. All the systems of morals, which address themselves with a view to their happiness, as it is called, what else are they but suggestions for behavior adapted to the degree of danger from themselves in which the individuals live? Recipes for their passions, their good and bad propensities, insofar as such have the will to power and would like to play the master, small and great expediencies and elaborations, permeated with the musty odor of old family medicines and old wife wisdom. All of them grotesque and absurd in their form, because they address themselves to all, because they generalize where generalization is not authorized. All of them speaking unconditionally and taking themselves unconditionally. All of them flavored not merely with one grain of salt,